link to the YouTube presentation at the top of the window at the moment. So we've got a jam-packed agenda tonight. We're going to go through some of the news items that came out of the Power Platform Conference, which was held a couple of weeks back. I've also included some other news which we may have missed from the previous session, just some nice items which I thought were pretty interesting and really awesome to see. Then we've got Mr. O'Donovan coming in and talking about Power Platform environment strategies, and especially with the landing zones coming into play. We've worked with landing zones in Azure for a while. Now we're bringing out those same strategies inside there, so Mike will be taking us through that. Then David, I'm guessing that you've got the tech tip for today, and then we're just going to have an open floor for discussions. Okay. So without further ado, let me jump into the news. Okay, so quite a few cool announcements coming in, but I also wanted to touch on some of the other things that I came across while searching for the session today. The one thing is we're doing a lot more deeper integration into SAP. So we are bringing in, because SAP is such a huge solution, so many companies are utilizing it, we felt it pertinent to make sure that we're bringing in some additional capabilities. Now, we do have a private preview currently running with select customers who are testing this out at the moment, and they are really commenting and saying that this is really game changing. Now, we are bringing in some pre-built Power Apps for some common SAP tasks and processes. You're seeing some of those on the screen now. We're also bringing in some pre-built Power Automate flows. So instead, in the past, where you had to go in and create everything from the beginning, we've got these templates which are focusing on those common tasks, which can really help a lot. We've brought in some new advanced SAP system connectors to help with the management and process of it. There is also a new on-premise data gateway to help make sure that that facilitation of that traffic is handled correctly. There is a new SAP connector with some new actions in it, and then we're also bringing in some new logic app functions into the platform as well. We've also enhanced the single sign-on capabilities with SAP. This new gateway is going to add features such as Kerberos delegation to ensure that the SSO is a seamless experience between Power Apps, Power Automate, and SAP. A big challenge in the past, if you had different usernames in SAP compared to what you had in Azure Active Directory, there were lots of challenges in trying to get around that. Now, this new data gateway is going to help improve that performance. We're also making sure that there is backwards compatibility with prior versions of the SAP connector as well, so that you are still able to continue to run your flows. This is great to see. Another one, we're also introducing the test engine. So once again, as we know, testing is vitally important. And especially when more and more developers are making use of the platform, we want to make sure that whatever they're doing can be integrated into their application lifecycle management processes. So we've launched now the test engine, and this is going to be a great component to help test Canvas apps before they get released into production. So also some great insights here. Definitely go and check it out. Now, this is a month late, but the really awesome thing is now we have cards for Power Apps. So this is based on the adaptive card framework, and we're bringing that directly into Power Apps for you to start building out cards in minutes with this no-code designer. So just like you saw before, that drag and drop card designer that we had on adaptivecards.io, we now have these capabilities directly in Power Apps itself. We can also connect these cards to data connectors in the platform that we have available, and it makes it very easy for you to start bringing in all of these components and adjusting and customizing your cards. Once again, without the need for writing any code. So this is really awesome to see. Another huge ask that I've been dealing with customers for years and they've been wanting it is the ability to co-author in Power Apps. So yes, now it is no longer just a single player experience. People will be able to start co-authoring apps together in asynchronous communication. Or what people would be able to do is just open up that app and be able to watch what other people are doing. So think about the situation where you're trying to teach someone else how to work through the app. They can open it up, get that experience directly from there. Now, this has been, people have been asking for this for years and asking why aren't we doing it already, because we've done it with the rest of the Office 365 suite. So now when you're building out a Canvas app, you'll be able to co-author that directly with your users. Another awesome feature is matchmaking with integrated virtual agents in Powerapps. So now makers, or experienced makers, can be nominated as advisors into an advisor program. Other admins can assign those individuals or as advisors, or over time, successful makers with strong track records can automatically receive in-product invitations through this intelligent matchmaking. But what this essentially enables is the ability for when people are building out apps in your organization and they get stuck with something, they can use this program, use the chatbot to be able to instantly connect with experienced personnel inside the organization to help them solve the challenge which they're having. And this is going to move into public preview soon, so definitely keep your eyes on this one. Okay. Next one that's really awesome is named formulas in Powerapps. So name formulas is just a way for us to very easily put these items together and be able to reference them. So you're going to have a new property on the app called app.formulas, and this is where you're going to be creating these items here. So you can see on the page, and I've got a couple of examples to go through here, but you can see that user email equals user.email. So we can just reference user email or user info or user title when we're busy structuring our formulas. And this can help you bind these things very quickly, very easily. Now, you could just set these in app on start, but there is some challenges with that, especially when it comes to loading and starting up the app itself. So using the new app.formulas definition is going to be that single source of truth. It always stays up to date regardless of when that calculation is performed, and that formula's value is always visible. So in the past, if you had it on start, you had to run on start for it to update accordingly. Now it will be able to update when that item is called directly. So that is going to have a dramatic improvement on performance. Now you can see many of the set calls are set up as simple constants, but in this example, you can start to see how this is all coming together. So we're able to set all these variables, and then as they're called up, we're able to translate those directly into there. You can start to see how these are coming up as we go through. So you can see there the differences between the app on start and then the in-app formulas. Let me actually get these both up and running. So none of the references to these properties need to change. You can cut and paste directly from the app start to the app formulas. You can modify the syntax as you need, and that is it. So this way, it just makes it easier to continue using these items without having to rely on something like app start. So now also, instead of setting the variables, these formulas will calculate them, and they can be specified directly there. This makes it much easier to read, because what you're essentially doing is decoupling all these definitions directly. Now, you can just see some more examples of this chess game that he went and created with AI and the way it connects to the VM. So once again, you can see how this is referenced as opposed to the app on start into app formula. So also really exciting to see. Now we're also introducing an automation kit. So this is the automation kit for Power Platform, and it's really designed for organizations to manage, govern, and scale their automation platform. And this is based on industry best practices. Now, this toolkit is a collection of components and tools based on heat concepts, and it's built using Powerapps and Power Automate. So it gives you the ability to easily extend it as you need. Fairly similar to the COE, we want to make sure that you are able to customize it based on your individual requirements. And this toolkit really helps accelerate your organizational's automation COE. It includes a set of Powerapps applications, Power Automate flows, and ready-made solutions to help manage any automation project you have. You can capture near real-time value tracking and even gain insights to your automation initiatives. Now, this kit was built with feedback from our customers who are using Power Automate and as their choice for automation and RPA platforms. Now, along with this, we're also bringing in the Coe Dashboard that provides a holistic view of all the automation projects you have, your return on investments, and your goals. Now, this can include multiple views and metrics that are automatically calculated and refreshed based on what you have defined is important for you in your automation projects. Now, this will give you the ability to identify which project to work on using the complexity score and even an understanding of the estimated savings. This is really going to help you prioritize your projects that you have currently. So you can make sure that you're focusing on the items that are going to give you the best return on value first, based on the amount of complexity and the return on investment and the savings that it's going to have at the end of the day. So with that, I just want to see if anyone else picked up anything interesting from the conference over the last couple of days.
That's a negative, Ghost Rider.
Okay, perfect. Mike, from your side, anything that you found interesting?
No, I don't find anything interesting.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks for sharing that. That was very cool. Adaptive cards looks pretty interesting. The fact that I can take like a button on an adaptive card and bind it to an expression or a connector suddenly means that adaptive card is interacting with data. Whereas the ones like you create from adaptivecards.io, then you have to call an HTTP endpoint, like it gets a little bit tricky to bind it to data. So to use just Power Platform connectors, pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Should I take over?
You
now I
can.
need to figure out how to share my desktop. You stop sharing yours, does mine automatically share?
Let's see. It's sharing in the room, it's not sharing online. So maybe just on the panel there, there should be a share option. There we go. It's up.
And that avatar is cool. Okay.
Yeah.
You look a lot younger. In real life.
Maybe. I might be able to have hair one day.
Yeah. Okay. So let's do that. So you can see my slide?
Yes, looks good.
So in the room, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We've got 11 people in the room, and online, I think there's about 16. So online's winning today, unfortunately.
There's up to 22 now.
Oh,
quite a few more.
Online's definitely winning. I really don't like microphones. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next half an hour or so talking about a very exciting topic. I mean, this stuff is riveting. I'm going to be talking about environment strategy. And whenever the topic covers the word strategy, people get so excited. And specifically what we're going to cover is what is an environment. Hopefully I don't have to go into too much detail there. What is an environment strategy and what should one look like? How do you know you don't have one? And And what are some of the questions you should be asking of yourselves in terms of creating an environment strategy? I'm then going to go into landing zones, COE toolkit, and COE. So I'm going to just kind of like make it not so confusing in terms of what all these things are and what's important. This is not prescriptive, but hopefully you're going to start asking yourselves some questions, some hard questions around if you're doing something wrong or right. There is no wrong or right, but yeah. And then at the end of it all, I've asked Clinton, who works for a large FSI, to talk about what they're doing. So I'm going to ask him some questions like, how do you determine when you should create a new environment? How do you determine what connectors are allowed, etc. So I'm going to ask him some interesting questions, and hopefully we'll learn a lot through this process. And you're welcome to ask questions as we go. Cool? So why am I doing this session? Because Tian asked me to. Yeah, it was last time. He said, yeah. So often what happens is I end up helping organizations, or I end up helping an individual in an organization, like fix a flow, or fix a Power App, or whatever it might be. And I often notice in the top right-hand corner of their Maker portal that they're in an environment called default. And immediately I know there's something wrong. Most of the time I know there's something wrong. One is because it's called default, or it's called default bracket upgrade close bracket. And what they're doing, I'm like, that probably shouldn't be in your default environment. So I see a lot of houses being built without the correct foundation underneath. And so I'm hoping this will get you asking questions of yourselves or of your customers. So that's why we're doing it. And what we're specifically talking about, I think to start off with, is environments. Before I actually go into the types of environments, let me do this. This is hard, holding a microphone and driving a mouse and not being able to see. Actually, before I start this, I've got this joke. So I decided I'm going to try this joke for the first time. I made it up today. It's terrible. So Power Automate and Power Virtual Agent, they meet in a bar, in a pub. And Power Automate says to Power Virtual Agent, hey, dude, you see behind the bar there, there's lots of free booze. Why don't you just take one? Like, take one. Let's steal it. So Power Virtual Agent says, but, are you crazy? And Power Virtual Agents can't actually say the word but says, but, are you crazy? Have you seen the barman? He's an AI builder. It's going to hit me hard. So don't worry, but don't worry. So Power Automate says, listen, if that happens, if it looks like he's going to hit you, just run outside, and right next to the pub, I've parked my boat, and we can just jump into the boat and we'll drive away fast. So Power Virtual Agent says, listen, I'm really worried. You know, if I jump and I miss the boat, I'm going to go into the water and the stream is running fast and it's going to take me down the river. And Power Automate says, don't worry, dude, just go with the flow. Brilliant, eh? Okay, if you didn't get that, you haven't been using Power Automate for long enough. Okay, so, and if there's any future jokes, David's going to tell them because he's brilliant. Okay, so let's talk about environment. So what I've got here is my admin portal for Power Platform, and we can see a whole bunch of environments here. What is an environment, just quickly? I guess it's kind of like a ring fence place where we build solutions and potentially have data, and it's ring fenced from other environments. In the old days, we used to even call them instances instead of environments, but these days we call them environments. And often you'd have an environment, for example, I'm building a solution, and I might want an environment for dev, I might want an environment for test, or I might want an environment for prod, or all three of those, and I want to move an application between them. Or I might have an environment specifically for HR for their solutions, and I might have an environment for IT for their solutions. So there's many reasons why you might have environments. And so from here, you can go and create them. And so literally you click here, hey, I want a new environment. click new, and off you go. And when you create an environment, it asks what type of environment you want. So is it a sandbox, is it a production, etc. And I'll get onto the different types of environments you can create in a minute. The one interesting thing, the little tip of the day, is by default, anyone in the organization can create an environment. That's the default. It's kind of like, but my users don't know how to do that and get to this. Well, actually they do, because in the top right-hand corner of the Power Platform, or Powerapps and Power Automate Maker portals, there's a link directly here. So it could be that they are creating these things. And so one of the tips that we generally recommend as Microsoft is to go here into your Power Platform settings and do not allow everyone to create production and sandbox environments. And potentially you don't want to allow them to create trial environments either. First tip for the day. Another tip for the day, just on a side note, is do enable tenant level analytics. This gives you much more insights about your environments and the apps and the flows in your environments than the default analytics that are in the Power Platform. So I certainly do recommend turning that on. Okay, so let's just go back quickly to the different types of environments. Depending on who you speak to, they'll tell you there's 8 or 7 or 9 different types of environments. These are the ones that I think are the most important for you to know of. The default environment is a special type of environment. It's automatically there when your tenant is created. You can't delete it. Every single user in the organization is a maker in that environment, so any user can go into that environment and build an app or build a flow, and you cannot turn that off. It is just like that by default. Then you get production environments and sandbox environments, and essentially these are production. Typically, this is where my production solutions are going to live, right? And sandbox is generally used more for, I guess, development types of scenarios. There's actually not that much difference between the two types, but a sandbox you can reset. So you can reset a sandbox environment back to its original state. So certainly if you are doing hackathons, training, dev, and you need to be able to reset it, you can do that. If you get the type wrong, don't stress, because you can switch sandbox to production and production to sandbox. You can switch these types of environments around. When you create them, it is going to consume 1 gig of Dataverse storage just off the bat. So you can't create these unless you've got more than 1 gig of Dataverse storage available. When you try and create it, it'll say, sorry, I can't, you don't have enough storage. And then we've got a special type of environment called a developer environment. And what these are self-created by developers who go and sign up for the community plan or the development plan. And what happens is they get an environment for themselves. It's called their name, essentially. And this is, in some ways, you could consider it a playpen where they can go and build and test out scenarios for themselves. It doesn't consume Dataverse storage, which is pretty cool. And they can also invite others into that environment as well. So they can actually share solutions or share applications inside of that environment. There's a Teams type environment, and this is created every time you, inside of a Microsoft team, go and build a solution or build an app, and it creates a Dataverse instance called Dataverse for Teams. And you'll find this in your environment list as well. And then you get 2 types of trial environments, which is quite confusing, but eventually it'll kind of sink in. You get something called a subscription-based trial, and what this basically is only admins can go and create this type of trial. Okay, you can create a maximum of 3. Also, a good example to use these for is stuff like training or hackathons. You just want to quickly try something out. You can delete it. It's certainly not production. And then you get a different type of trial, which is based on the fact that a user has signed up for a trial themselves. So a user has gone to trials.dynamics.com or apps.powerapps.com/trial, and they've signed up for a trial of Powerapps Premium or something like that, and then it creates an environment for them. Okay. And if, for example, if you look in the admin center, let's just cancel this. My eyes are not so good. I only have trials in my environment. So you'll see here, these ones that have 7 days and 8 days remaining are user-based trials, and those environments are going to die. Whereas my subscription-based, so the admin-based ones that I've gone and created, they're actually going to live. But I might delete them, but they're not production. Yeah. Make sense? Any questions? Is the basics being covered? Okay, special note on default environments. I think I've covered most of this except for the fact that the maximum size it can grow to from a Dataverse perspective is 1 terabyte, and you can't manually back it up. It is automatically backed up behind the scenes by Microsoft as part of the managed service, but you can't physically go and back it up yourself at a point in time where you can with the other types of environments. Microsoft's recommendation is to rename the default environment to personal productivity and share with users that this is the place that you go and build not mission critical apps. In other words, if an app here goes down or breaks, we're not losing the organization money. These are designed for personal productivity, almost like solutions like Outlook rules that you do in Outlook today. You know, if an email comes from this person, then do this. It's for your personal productivity. So you might create flows and apps for your personal productivity, maybe to replace some Excel files or automate some Excel stuff or whatever it might be, but it's not mission critical. And the other recommendation is to restrict the connectors in this environment to only those that are for personal productivity, like Microsoft 365 connectors, and not allow the likes of the SQL connectors, the Azure connectors, Oracle, SAPs. I have heard of situations where organizations haven't done this, and in this environment are applications using those connectors. Now they try and go back and turn off those connectors, but they can't because there's applications using them. And in some cases, it's quite hard to move those applications because there's dependencies. And so they're stuck. And so now those connectors are still on because they can't turn them off and you get this kind of loop. So you want to try and do something like this. This is Microsoft's recommendation. You don't have to do this. But you probably want to look at something like this, especially considering everyone is a maker. Makes sense? Okay. I have been through these recommendations to turn off the ability for everyone to create production and sandbox environments, and you might want to do that from a trial environment perspective as well if you do want to just like limit the amount of, call it environment sprawl. So what is an environment strategy? So I kind of said there's 4 key pillars or 4 things you need to answer as part of an environment strategy. Okay, number 1, which environments do you want in the tenant to begin with? Okay, besides the default environment. I know you don't have an environment strategy if you only have one environment. Okay, that I do know. But that's the thing that I can tell you based on if I look at your environments today. The next thing you want to do is, what is the process to request an environment? If I'm turning it off for users to create their own, well, how do they get them? So what's the process for someone to request one? Next, what's the process to determine if they need one? So a user requests one. Well, let's back up. Do they even know that they need one? But a user does request one. Should their solution go into an existing environment or should they get their own environment? And if they get their own environment, how many do they get? 1, 2, 3, 4? Dev, test, prod, or just one? I hope you're getting a sense of what this is. And then when you create that environment, what are your standards around properties and settings for these environments? Naming conventions, URL naming conventions. What cadence are you allowed in terms of the auto update of features in that environment? Is it frequent? Is it moderate? What connectors are you going to allow? Are you going to allow custom connectors? Is there a chargeback model associated to environments? And this is quite an interesting one because many organizations do try and do this, where if a business unit needs an environment, they will cross-charge to that BU, that there's a cost associated to it, and ultimately often it's down to the storage that it consumes. That's how they charge it. So there's a lot of things to consider in terms of what am I allowed to go and turn on. TDS endpoint. So TDS endpoint means you can open up SQL Management Studio and browse the dataverse as if it's a SQL database. Pretty cool, but do you want to allow that in all cases? What does it mean if users are doing that? So these are all things that you need to think of. So here's an example strategy diagram from the governance white paper from Microsoft. Okay, so you can just go and find the governance white paper. This is one, I'll zoom in a little bit. It's a very basic one, really, but we'll go into it. So what they're saying in this example, they're going to have the default environment. They're going to rename it to personal productivity. They're going to allow developer environments. So developers can have their own environments, and each developer is the owner of their environments. Cool beans. The next row is interesting. Basically what they're saying is there's a business unit that needed a specific solution built. Now the solution might be something they custom built, or it might be something like Dynamics 365, like Dynamics 365 Sales or Dynamics 365 Customer Service, and they know they need it just for that business unit. So on the far right-hand side, they've got a prod environment. So they know they need a prod environment because users need to access it. But they also know that this is mission critical, so it needs to have an ALM process associated to it. So they decided I also need a dev and I also need a test. Makes sense. And what they're also saying is developers are makers in the dev environment. Developers are not makers in the test environment. They're just users because they shouldn't be able to make changes. Makes sense. And they're also saying that I create unmanaged solutions in the dev environment, and I put a managed solution into the test environment and a managed solution into the production environment. And they kind of put that down on a piece of paper, and that's their rule. The one underneath is also a little bit interesting. What they're saying here is, I've also got an environment that a business unit owns, but this business unit is actually going to share this environment with another business unit. So there's actually going to be apps from multiple business units in this production environment. Why? Probably because they need to share data. They probably need to share data that's sitting in the Dataverse. There's tables that these applications need to share. Probably. I don't know why they decided that, but probably. So we've got one prod environment, but they decided that they need separate dev environments, almost like if I'm an ISV and I build a solution and I put it onto the store, I'm going to build my solution in a separate environment, but it doesn't really matter where it goes at the end. So they're saying, cool, we've got a shared prod environment, but we've got separate dev environments and a shared test environment. Makes sense? Tion, you happy? Okay, Tion's nodding. Okay, so then I thought to myself, okay, that was a pretty basic one. Could I come up with a template that says this is what you should start with? And I actually thought to myself, maybe I should create like, I don't know if any of you have been around for a long time, like in the old SharePoint days, we used to have something called a small farm, a medium farm, and a large farm. And I thought, could I create something like this? And my mind got too bent and I couldn't do it. But I came up with this scenario here that said, as a starter, maybe you should do something like this. Now, throw stones at this, please, because this is absolutely not right. It might be right for one organization, but not another organization. But this is something that you want to consider. So what it's basically saying is, what environment should I start with? So I've got personal productivity. You all happy with that one? Okay. Only M365 connectors. The audience is everyone. We want to promote people to go and build stuff in them. Okay. We want to support them. Go forth and conquer users. And then I thought, well, then we need another environment where people can go and build applications or deploy applications, build a Power App, a Flow, but it can use premium connectors. So for example, we do want to allow them to connect to an Azure Cognitive Service or a SQL database, etc. But it shouldn't just be available to everyone, because I probably want to make sure that those users know what they're doing before they get let loose in there. And so maybe I have a process that first validates that they've done the Power Platform fundamentals training, whatever it might be, and then I grant them access. So the audience isn't everyone, it's only approved makers. So you have a security group, and users go into that security group, and that security group is assigned to the environment. You will see now and again, and I couldn't find it, it looks like Microsoft's removed it from the governance document, but there used to be this triangle, and then it had the 3 layers. Personal productivity at the bottom, then this type of environment, and then specific environments. And then I thought to myself, okay, cool, but what happens if we want to categorize slightly differently? What happens if we do want to allow SAP connectors to some users but not to other users? Now, the only way you can do that is per environment. So you may end up having different levels of environments. So this level B is another environment, also a production environment, but it just might allow more connectors, okay, to different types of systems, to ERP systems. Make sense? Okay. An admin environment, this is a general best practice, is you have an environment called admin, and in here is the Center of Excellence Toolkit, and all the other things that go in with the COE toolkit. So there's lots more than just the inventory stuff, but there's apps and scenarios, etc. But the recommendation is it's got its own dedicated Power Platform environment. If you have Dynamics 365 scenarios, you're definitely going to have separate environments for those. And generally, if you're deploying Dynamics 365 customer service or sales or marketing or any of those, you're probably going to have a dev, a test, and a prod at minimum. You might have a UAT, you might, I don't know what you define, but you're typically going to have all of those. And so once again, we know that prod is for prod and test is probably prod as well, actually, but certainly dev, maybe that's a sandbox environment and not a prod type environment. Is this making sense so far? Okay. And then we've got as required. So as requirements come in, hey, I'm in HR and we want to build a leave management system. Or I'm in HR, or I want procurement, I want to build a tender management system. Where does that go? Does it go into these things up here? Do we create a specific environment for them? So there's questions you need to ask to determine whether they get their own. Do you need dev, test, prod, etc. And then obviously we have developer environments for developers when they go and have their playpens. Okay, how do users request an environment? There's different approaches for this that I've seen. The COE Toolkit has an app that allows users to request an environment. Some people just use a Microsoft form. So you go to a SharePoint site, there's a Microsoft form there, you fill it in, and they might not even ask for an environment. They just want to do something beyond what they can do in the default environment, and they're just looking for help. And then through that process, you determine, hey, I need to go and get an environment for them. This is from the COE Toolkit for that app, which is there by, well, you can just go and deploy it. And it allows users to request a new environment. This is the approval flow that's in there by default. So you just essentially have to go and configure it. I'm not going to go through the details, but it's actually pretty cool. And you can just go and use it. And so this is the sample app. This is the app that comes with the COE Toolkit. So a user can go in and say, new, I want a new Power Platform environment. They can choose the type, the region, the purpose, how long they want it for. And based on their duration, then you might create them a trial or not create them a trial. Or you might have notifications to clean it up after time. And then this is the screen that allows you to approve or reject the request. And if approved, go and auto-create that environment for the user. This does kind of assume your users know what they're doing, though. Like, they know to request a sandbox versus a production. Another screen that asks, actually I didn't show you, is what connectors do you need? So it asks the users, it gives them all the connectors and says, which connectors do you want to use? And then depending on what they check, that comes into the approval request, you decline it or approve it. But also, once again, users might not know what connectors they use, and so there's a consultation process associated to it. Okay, so what determines whether you need a new environment or not? And then I also thought, yeah, hey, maybe we create this like whole process flow, a decision tree. And I thought it's too complicated. Like, just ask some fundamental questions. So the first question is, do they need a Dataverse or not? Because if they don't need a Dataverse, it's highly likely that solution can just go into either the default environment or one of those two citizen environments I listed earlier on. As soon as they need the Dataverse, then life changes. And then the next question is does data in this dataverse need to be shared with anyone else? Or does it need to be kind of siloed? Or does it need to be shared with other solutions? Or does it need to consume other data that's in a different environment? So that kind of makes sense. So for example, you might have deployed Dynamics 365 sales into one environment. In there's lots of leads. So there's a leads table. It's massive. And so there's lots of contacts there as well. And there's a business requirement to create this kind of like new mobile app for salespeople to go out into the field. Well, that mobile app probably has to be in that environment. Otherwise, it's not going to be very easy for it to look up the leads and the contacts for the customers. Does that make sense? But if, hold on, no. I've got different leads. It's a different business unit. These leads are not the same. The contacts are not the same. Well, then it needs its own dataverse environment. Make sense? You're very quiet. You're very quiet. Okay. Does it need Dynamics 365 apps? That would certainly determine if it needs to go into its own set of environments, and then what do you need? And this is an interesting one. Who's going to pay if you have a chargeback model? Because, wow, I've seen business units, in quotes, fight, right? You're stealing my storage. Okay, well, one thing you can do is create two separate environments, and then each environment consumes its own amount of storage. Therefore, it's quite easy to charge back to the BUs based on how much storage it's being used. But if they're all in one environment, it's very hard to determine how much storage each business unit or each application is taking in that dataverse. So I think your chargeback model also influences your decision of whether it's a separate environment or not. Another interesting attribute is pay-as-you-go. So pay-as-you-go is the ability for Powerapps and Power Automate flows to consume Azure credit rather than use Power Platform licensing. But this is a setting you turn on a per environment basis. So if you turn it on for an environment, it means apps in that environment can consume Azure money instead of Power Platform user licenses or flow licenses. Cost of creating a dataverse environment, 1 gig. No, the cost is potentially an administrative overhead of having 100,000 environments in your tenant. Does that really matter? Probably not, I guess. I don't know. I know, like, there's always been this thing, and I even also remember this also in the SharePoint days. It's like, limit the number of site collections. Why? I don't know. I just know that too many is too much. But if you're not paying for any additional storage, so it's more, I guess, the perception or the admin overhead of maybe managing all these different environments. But if you've got good processes in place, yes, that could happen. Never heard of that happening. So technically, is there a problem of having millions, thousands of environments? No. I mean, think about it. Every time you create a team, and you create a solution in that team, you create a dataverse environment. So most of the environments that organizations have today are actually dataverse teams for dataverse environments. But you don't even see it, so does it make a big difference? But something to consider. Okay, I'm not going to go through all the properties you want to consider, but I think if you've ever created an environment and gone to properties, you will see that there's a lot. There's a few to call out which I think are pretty interesting that you do want to think about. One of them is your naming convention. I don't know, I'm just like pedantic like this. I want everything, like I can look at the column and I can see exactly what it is. I've seen various different naming conventions for environments that include stuff like who's the BU that owns it, is it dev, test, or prod? Are probably the two most common things to put in there. And maybe what's the purpose? So if it's got D365 enabled, put D365 in the name. If it doesn't have D365, don't. The good news is you can rename an environment with little to no impact. Like you can rename default to personal productivity. URLs are different. You can change the URL of an environment. I've done it. I'm sure you've done it. But there may be impact. Users go to, especially model-driven applications, through the URL. So if you then go and change it, they're not going to get to it. There are some products, even from Microsoft, that use the URL. And you might have developers that have built solutions using those URLs to gain access to the API, so the REST API. Something like Dynamics 365 Customer Insights. When you set it up, it says what Dataverse environment, what Power Platform environment are we going to put data flows in? And you give it the URL. If you ever then go and rename your environment, you've got a problem. So be very careful of renaming URLs. Okay, URLs, just be very careful. So when you initially create it, sure, if you after a day you realize, actually, I need to change it, change it. But I think once you're in, and there's solutions using it, be very, very careful. The other thing to know about URLs is they're globally, in quotes, unique. So this URL here, Contoso Sales.crm4, CRM4 is the region that it's in, that's Europe. That URL is unique. No other company can have the same name. So it is also worth considering, how do I make this thing unique, but also human readable and memorable. By default, it creates like org7926253 as the default thing. Any questions on that? Another thing you might want to determine as part of your strategy is what regions do you allow. When you create an environment, it goes into a region. An environment can't be split across regions. I can't have an environment that's in Australia and Europe. Okay, it's in Europe, or it's in Australia, or it's in the US. You've got the drop down of where you can create your Power Platform environments. And you may, as an organization, determine that you're only allowed to create it in Europe, as an example. But that's something that you would need to determine. So the question is there a South African region? I'm just going to paraphrase. And I'm going to say no, there isn't a South African region. Yeah, there's no South African region. There's no South African region. So, yeah, we would like the South African region to be turned on, and we all desire that and hope that will happen in the future. There's a question, there's a hand in Teams. Michael.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to know, with regards to having the ability to create these different environments. So say, for instance, you've got about one environment, but in essence, you've got about 3 business units or 3 different divisions. You want to kind of like split it up that not all 3 divisions kind of like have access to each one. Is it a possibility to kind of like validate, depending on how their Azure account is set up, that they only access a specific environment?
So when you create your environment, and even after the fact, you can go and put a security group on that environment. And so only people of that security group can access that environment. Even if a user accidentally tries to share an app in that environment to someone outside of that security group, it won't work. So yes, you can absolutely do that. And that will prevent people seeing other people's environments just by nature of setting up those permissions. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it answers the question. Thanks a lot.
Literally, if I go and create a new environment, you'll see at the bottom, Sorry, what did I do wrong? You see, I need 1 gig of space. And now it's going to tell me I don't have lots of things, but okay. I can't create. But on the next page, there's an option to choose which security group has access to that environment. So that's a good practice to go into. Okay. Just another tip. Once you have figured out what your environment strategy is, I've seen this work quite well, is organizations create a SharePoint site as a way of communicating to the organization stuff like, where do I create an app? How do I create an app? What's my link to learning, certification? How do I request an environment if my ask falls outside of what you provide by default? Other stuff are like application templates, patterns. Some organizations will come up with very specific patterns on how you should connect to on-premises, as an example. And so these types of things get put onto a SharePoint site, and this gets made available to the organization so people know the guardrails, the environment strategy, and how to log a ticket if they're having an issue, link to public forums that are good. This meetup, as an example. Sometimes business units also take something that one business unit created and make it available as a template for another business unit to use. Especially in the larger organizations, then they upload those as well. There is actually a SharePoint template for this. I did not know this. It's pretty cool. So there is a SharePoint template called the Power Platform Hub. And it's a good starter. You can just go and download it and put it into your SharePoint environment. If you just go and search the World Wide Web for Power Platform Hub template, you will find it. It's on GitHub, and it gets you started. You might not like it, customize it, change it, but it's a good idea to have something like this to communicate. Maybe another good idea is a Yammer group or a team, or whatever it is in terms of building and allowing the community and the organization to build solutions in the right place. Okay, so we have this concept of an environment strategy. We need to know what type of environments we allow, what's the naming convention, who can create them, when can create them, where do they live, what's the chargeback model, etc., etc. And then you're going to find documentation from Microsoft that refers to interchangeably these 3 titles. There's something called Power Platform Landing Zones. There's something called Power Platform North Star Architecture. And there's something called Power Platform Reference Architecture. Okay, they're all exactly the same thing. And what it is, it's an implementation of an environment strategy. It's Microsoft's best practice reference architecture on what environments you should have and what connectors should be enabled in them. So for example, when you implement this, it will rename your default environment to personal productivity. It will stop connectors other than the M365 connectors. It will go and do this automatically. Okay, so it actually physically does it. Do you believe me? Has anyone played with it? So let's jump here. So here it is. You'll see here it's called the Power Platform Landing Zones, but later on it's called the Reference Architecture. They're all essentially talking about the same thing. It's the implementation of an environment strategy. Now, when you look at this, this GitHub repository, there's 2 kind of rows. The top row, if you go and tell it to deploy it, will go and change existing stuff. Okay, it'll rename rename default to personal products. It'll change existing stuff. The second one, which they call the vending machine, is a quick way of creating new environments. Okay, so you might not do the top one. You might just do the second one and do everything the top one does manually. You might do that because you're scared of it, just like going and turning off connectors in your existing environments. But what happens is when you click one of these 2 links here, and let me just click the first one, what it's actually going to do is it's going to create or open up a template in Azure. And this template is going to ask me questions. And depending on what I select, it's going to go and do. Okay, so let's try and bump the font up here. That's a little better. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's do that. So you'll see it's got a bunch of different settings I can go and change. Initially, it wants to know like which identity is it actually going to use to connect to the Power Platform and make the changes. And so, for example, assign the recommended data loss prevention policy to the tenant. So it's got different categories of data loss prevention policies. So maybe we want high restriction. It's only going to essentially allow a few Microsoft 365 connectors as the default policy for all environments. When I click next, it's going to go do it. Now, if you want to know more detail of what it's actually doing, in the GitHub repository behind the scenes, it's PowerShell. So you can actually go and open up the PowerShell and see what it's doing behind the scenes if you're interested in that way inclined. Do I want to prevent me sharing apps to other tenants? Okay, do I allow my apps to be shared with other organizations, users, or do I want to allow the reverse? Do I allow my users to use other organizations' tenants? Do I want to allow sharing, etc.? So there's a bunch of settings you go and change here, and it'll go and do it for you. Here we go. Do I want an admin environment? Do I want to? What's actually pretty cool, it can create an admin environment and deploy the COE toolkit for you. We'll go and do it. You can set up Azure integration to Azure Monitor, so you can get additional logs and analytics. And the landing zones is the one which is the same as, but if you chose vending machine, it'll only give you this tab. And then you can go and create environments through here as well. So you can say, do I want to rename personal the default environment? No. I want to create some environments for citizen developers. How many environments do you want to create for citizen developers? Let's create 5. Give it a naming convention, give it a description, what DLP policy should be associated, what's the region, the currency. So all the stuff you would manually do through the admin center, you essentially can go and set up here. Do I want dev, test, and prod for all of them? Do I want a billing policy for pay as you go? And then you hit review and create, and it'll go and do it. More so, I can even go down and ask it to go and build and create environments for the different clouds that Microsoft has. So the healthcare cloud, the financial services, retail cloud, we'll go and create specific environments for them and deploy those applications as well. Makes sense? Makes sense. Okay, what's the time? Ooh, I'm going on long, and I want to ask Clint a whole bunch of questions. Okay, so the COE toolkit, just quickly, just to kind of share what this is. It started off quite a while ago. I'm going to say it's about 2 years ago. I don't know, maybe that long. With just this component here called the inventory components. And when you deploy it and it runs in your tenant, it goes and catalogs all the apps, the flows, the connectors they use, who's the makers. It just gives you a huge amount of insight into what people are doing in your tenant that the default analytics doesn't do. And then from there, they started adding additional stuff, for example, theming components, allowing you to apply consistent themes across your apps. Innovation backlog, so allowing users to request applications. The one I showed you earlier on was the component that allows people to request an environment. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. It's reminders to go and delete orphaned applications, environments that aren't being used. So certainly something I would go and look at if you haven't deployed it, and look at deploying this and configuring it. So that's the COE toolkit. Something I often hear people doing is like confusing the COE toolkit to a COE. Okay, so a COE, a center of excellence, is more around the people in the process. I prefer to think of it as a center of empowerment. So what we're seeing organizations doing is creating a team, physically a team, that this is their job, And their job is not to build solutions for the business. That's not their job. Their job is to empower the business to build their own solutions. Okay. And so I wanted to spend a lot of time, but I've yabbed on for so much that maybe this is a topic for another day in terms of how do you build a center of empowerment? What does it look like? What are the typical things that they do? And only one of them is an environment strategy. But there's other stuff like support models, value realization. How do I know that I'm actually getting value from the platform? How do I derive and determine which apps are deriving what value, etc.? How do I make it fun? How do I create app catalogs, etc., etc., etc.? But this is a topic for another day, so we're not going to do it now, because what I do want to do is make sure that I bring in someone who's a lot smarter and who's been doing this at a much bigger scale. So Clint, are you online?
Hey, Michael. Yes, I am online.
Can I ask you some questions?
Sure. I don't think I am smarter, and I think you've covered a hell of a lot of content already in your Prezzo, and yeah, I found it fantastic just to sit back and listen to what you had to share. Thank you for that.
Some shot, dude. So maybe I can just start off by asking you one question. Well, I'll ask you lots of questions, but start off with one. In terms of the, so everyone understands the scale of your Power Platform environments, have you got any statistics, the environments you have, apps, makers, anything like that, so we have a sense of what you're doing?
Yeah, so from a maker's perspective, we've got just over 1,000 production solutions on the platform. We've got about 1,500 or so, and as far as environments go, we've got about excluding developer environments, we've got about 50 or so.
And Dataverse for Teams environments, do you have some of those?
Dataverse for Teams, yes. Babyverse, as we call it. We've got a handful. Often when we see that there is potentially some use for some of the premium products which are out of the box in Dataverse, and we find that maybe a license or extra licenses are not the best way to go about it. That's kind of when we use Dataverse for Teams. So we most certainly have those environments in organization or our tenant as well. Yes.
So how do you guys determine when you need a new environment versus using an existing? And I guess maybe also just to follow on from that, how do users know to request an environment? Like, what's your process?
So our process is, it's not, I couldn't pull up a flowchart for you now. Maybe if I put my head to it, we could come up with some sort of a flowchart, but we find it's often a discussion. There's a couple of things that come to mind when we talk about environments. We talk about data leakage policies, which ties in with security, all your RBAC roles. We also have a look at splitting it. There might be a logical split for different departments, different countries in our organization. So truth be told, there's no one size fits all for us. It's often, as I mentioned earlier, it's a discussion. So we ask for me, my clients are all internal, so I would ask my clients, what do you want to achieve? Michael, you spoke a lot about the default environment, and from a best practice perspective, because everyone has access to go and be app makers on the default environment, we don't always want those. We don't always want everyone from a security perspective to be able to go and link up with SQL servers that's potentially on-prem or in cloud for that matter. We would rather, in the default environment, just have them play in a safe space, and that safe space for us is the Office 365 environment or connectors. And you can go and read debates from both sides, but in my opinion, there's nothing that someone can do on the Power Platform with those connectors as opposed to what they can go and do manually on the platform in any case. But yeah, that's I think that's another topic. But yeah, for us, it's is it dataverse? What kind of data are you storing? You've got to think about implicit connections. You could have connections that are established, and when you share it, it's shared implicitly as well. So you need a mechanism to control who are makers in certain environments. And even then, if the connection is implicitly shared, the person who is a user who now has access to that connection, they still can't go and reuse that in another solution because they are not a maker in that environment. So it's just a couple of things I would say that you need to consider. The security, the roles. Is there a reason to ring fence it? Sometimes you don't want to share a Dataverse environment potentially. Maybe there's some very sensitive data that is sensitive business data that is going into this Dataverse instance, and you actually want to completely ring fence it to that solution. We've got environments where we've got shared solutions as well, but typically those would be for business units or countries that are sharing this, and they've got for them to cross-pollinate in that sense, it's not a problem. So yeah, hopefully that's, I know it's as clear as mud, but that's kind of what we look at.
And how do you determine whether someone gets a sandbox? Do you allow developer environments, trials?
Trials, we try and avoid. I would rather give someone temporary access to an environment because, if you're dealing with trial environments that are going, that have a short life cycle of 30 days, 60 days, whatever the case may be, I think that causes a lot of admin overhead, and I would prefer to steer away from that. So I'd rather give someone access to a temporary sandbox environment. We are big fans of developer environments. It gives the user a safe space to go and learn, upskill, do some POCing, test some theories, and at the end of the day, you've got your DLP to fall back onto. So when the guys initially spin it up, they're going to have the default DLP that only allows the Office 365 connectors. And if they need anything more, that's then when they would reach out to us. So maybe just to add on to this, we are not using any of the features from the COE toolkit at the moment, and we've purposely chosen not to go that way to automate these environments being spun up, because there's it's really a way of how you can control, and maybe control is a bad word, because I mean that's really not our intention. It's not to be a control freak, but our intention is to keep our CIOs that they don't end up in the chookie, that we have that we conform to our regulations, that we don't fall on the bad side of that we know that these guys aren't doing anything naughty on the platform. So it's as opposed to it being open to everyone, it's rather let's request it, and then we go through the processes that we've got. we've got some formal processes around, you know, connecting to data. But from a platform perspective, it's often, you know, once again, a discussion. But I'm a big fan of the developer environments, because another thing it does is, you know, over what are we're probably going into year 7 or 8 of our Power Platform journey now. You know, after a while, you start seeing quite a few test apps in that default environment. So this also helps that you don't contaminate your other environments, and especially default. Default can get very, very messy very, very quickly. It's not a bad thing, because you want to see growth on the platform as well. So test apps, POC apps, I never see them as a bad thing. I actually see them in a positive light, because it shows me that there's people who are experimenting and they're trying to do things. And, you know, that's often their first entry onto the Power Platform journey, whether they are going to be a true citizen developer, whether they are a professional developer even, because I think all of you know that there's a spectrum. It caters for all of those. So yeah, developer environments, we don't do trials. As I mentioned, I'd rather give someone temporary access. And a good example of that is we've got a training environment for Power Automate Desktop. So we substitute the students on a cycle basis, so that they can go and do the material that they need to, and then we drop them off once they are done. And also from a licensing perspective, you know, the Power Platform licensing, you've got to have some sort of you know, handle on it, because there's a lot of licenses. So I also don't want a free for all, because we need to ensure that the licenses that are where money is being spent on, that we're actually getting value for it. You know, I mean, guys can go mull and create, you know, premium connectors on various apps. And the last thing I want them to do is to do that and then share it with the whole organization, which is about 50,000 people. That ball is gonna be up there, I can tell you that much. So we always so cautious of that.
The last question from me, and then I'm going to hand it to the floor. Maybe you mentioned something to me before around service accounts. It's not something I spoke about, but what do you use service accounts for?
So service accounts are fantastic in my opinion. So let me paint you an example, and we've seen this scenario time and time again. So we really do promote service accounts. It's part of our guardrails that we've actually published on our SharePoint site, and we try and educate users. But you know, there's always it doesn't always land with everyone, unfortunately. So picture a scenario where we've got Joe Soap in the organization. Joe Soap has now, even though he's only using the Office 365 connectors, he's not using anything premium. It still doesn't mean that it's maybe not a general or an enterprise solution. You know, this thing might actually be ingrained in a business process. Now, Joe Soap has been maintaining this for the last 6 months. His manager thinks it's the best thing since sliced bread. And now Joe Soap, he gets an offer somewhere else and he leaves the organization. His account gets disabled. And then what happens is that the connectors start breaking. The users start, you know, phoning IT support, and eventually through the breadcrumbs, they get to us as the center of excellence. And now we've got to rush around to try and find, okay, well, Joe Soap had this thing. His app is not even in a solution. I don't know how many flows he had attached to his application. They might be standalone flows, and now it's just a whole big mess. If we use service accounts, we can avoid a lot of that drama. So if JoziPug had from the beginning used the service account, simply when he leaves, hopefully he does hand it over. But even if he doesn't hand it over, it's a lot easier for us to say, aha, hold on, this this procurement solution that he built on the platform belongs to service account XYZ, and we can simply say, okay, well, who needs to take over the solution? Let's just give that person the access through our protocols to have access to that service account, and we can immediately, from a very large bucket, we can now say, okay, this flow belongs to that service account, and just becomes a little bit more manageable. So that's one of our big things for service account. And then it's also from a security perspective, you might not even want a named user to have access to some sort of a data store. Maybe it's a SQL database. So you would rather give the service account access to that. This thing just sort of runs in the background. So there's to me, those are two of the big reasons for a service account is your sustainability of your actual solution, and as well as from a security perspective.
Thank you. Okay, questions on the floor, online. Hold the phone, the mic.
Hi, Clinton. My name is Jason. I have
Hi,
a
Jason.
question around you said you have about 50 environments, and you go through this consultative approach to spin those up. How closely does that reference your business architecture? So I know in the FSI space you'll have different divisions or different clusters. Does it tie up with that business architecture, or is it just dev, test, prod for different solutions?
So that's an interesting question, Jason. So of course we do try and bring it sort of as closely together as possible, but we are not. It's also our role. We as a Center of Excellence, we're not policemen, and we don't dictate what needs to be done. We've got in our guardrails, we've got recommendations of what should be done. Should be speaking to architects, should be speaking to IT security, should be speaking to someone like data privacy. And based on the discussions, if it's something that is really like an enterprise application, this thing is now actually important. It's really, really important. For something like that, we're definitely going to have the first of all, because it's such a crucial application, we're probably going to segregate it into its own, ring-fence it into its own environments, and we'll most certainly have a dev, a UAT, and a production at the very least. If they say to us, well, look, we actually need something more because we want to align, then that's fine. That's fine by us. We will give them the extra environment as well if they require it. At the very least, though, if it's anything above pure productivity, we promote at the very least have a non-prod and a prod, because we don't want the guys tampering on their production. We've recently started educating the guys a little bit more about application lifecycle management. So of course your environments, that's a very, very key part. That's a very key part as well. So once again, for us, I don't think that there's a one size fits all. It depends on at the the solution at hand and what it's being used for, what it's doing, etc., etc.
Shot, dude. Jason says thank you. Any other questions? I know you all have lots, but you're too afraid to ask. Going once? Going twice? Sold. Thanks, Clint. Thanks very much for your time. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you for having me. I saw a hand on the chat, very brief, and then I saw it drop. I don't even know who it was. So I don't know if
They were giving you a high five.
High five. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Michael and Coe, thank you for having me. This was great.
Thanks, dude. Thanks very much. Okay, so we've now got David, who's going to do a tech tip under 8 minutes. It's all my fault for carrying on too long. So we'll hand over to. Yeah, David's just setting up.
Right, can you guys hear me? I'm a terrible typist, so I need both hands.
Yeah, I can hear you, David.
Sounds like a bit of a delay. Maybe this cable is too long. So,
A great joke.
all right, so seeing that we really don't have any much time left, we can do a very short tech tip of like 30 seconds, or we can do one of about 10 minutes. So who's for the 30 seconds one? Or a 10-minute one?
Why not do
Let's wait and
both?
see.
Come on.
Well, if I do the 10-minute one, inherently the 30 seconds one will be baked into it. So, right.
10
thing-
minutes and 30 seconds is good.
Okay, sold. All right, welcome everybody, and thanks, Michael. Thanks for that. So what I'm going to show you today is how to create errors in Powerapps. You might say, well, that's easy. I do it all the time. But the idea is that you're probably doing it wrong, right? So I'm going to show you how to properly generate errors, you know, like the good stuff. But then also to handle those and to do something with it. So think of a scenario where a user gets an error. So something went wrong, the wheels came off, something in the app couldn't function the way that you intended it to. Now the user gets this error and it tells them contact the administrator. Okay, so who do they phone? What do they do? You know, it's just in an organization with 50,000 employees, who's that guy? You know, who do I talk to? So what if you could capture that error, you could write it back into a data source somewhere, and you actually assign that to the necessary maker for that application. How cool would that be? So imagine the user experience of the user getting an error, and 10 minutes later they get a phone call from IT saying, or from the maker of the app that might not be in IT, and saying that, I see you had an error on my application. Can we please rerun that to understand more of what happened in that scenario? So that would be awesome, right? What I'm going to show you is how to do that. Right, so first thing, if we have an app, this is a very brand new basic app, nothing special to it. I've created a SharePoint list because SharePoint lists make the world go round. And basically in here, all that I'm doing is I created a few columns to just store the error logs. All right, and I called it error traces. I've got a title, got a system name, tells me who got the error, what the session ID was, where they got this error in, so you can group it by and see the user experience for that session. You can get the error type and then a responsible person. So you could actually have a flow that just goes and have a look at an asset register or to see who's the owner of this application and then automatically assign this error trace to that individual, right? So that would be pretty awesome if we can get that right. So what am I talking about if I'm talking about an error? Now, you might be familiar with, so let's add a button, because everything starts with a button, and you could have a notify, and you could say you got an error. And you might have some logic around that to go and say, if the following conditions are true, then generate this notification. But that obviously isn't going anywhere. That's just staying on the user screen, and once that thing goes away, it's the end of it. And you definitely don't want to now go and build a stack of logic in every check. So you don't want to go and say, if this and that is true, then give the user that error and then ship off this error to the SharePoint list. That just wouldn't make any sense. And there might be other errors in the app that are not handled. In other words, these are things that you go and check for specifically, but there might be other things that you're not checking for that could cause an error. So if we go into, first thing that we need to go and enable is just formula level error checking. So it's in the upcoming futures. And you'll see formula level error management. Now this has been in preview for 100 years. Also, if it's something is in preview in Powerapps, you can go ahead and use it. It's fine. Don't worry. And that's actually from Microsoft. Don't quote me, but they're saying that if something is experimental, steer clear. But if it's in preview, it's fairly safe, to use in production environments. And that's don't quote me on that. But seriously, like formula level error management has been around for a long time, and it's fairly safe to use. Yeah, so I forgot about that. But really, it's fine. There's actually some on Power Automate. If something is in preview or something, stay away from it and all of that. But if it's in Powerapps, it's fairly fine, I think. All right. So, what are we talking about? Let's go and in the app, you might have noticed in the app property, in the app settings, there's a function called app on error. All right. So that's like a universal error handler for the app. So truth be told, if an error gets generated in the app, it knows about it, and we can check it in the error logger. So if you go to, in the monitor, so if we generate an error, and the easiest way to generate an error is to tell a computer program to divide 1 divided by 0, and that immediately says, wheels fell off, don't know what to do with this. And if we go into the error logger, you'll see, the monitor, it actually generated an error. But the system didn't do anything with it because we haven't told it to do anything with it. So what we're now going to do is, first of all, go to the app on error, and we're just going to paste some formula in here. All right, so in here, let's just go delete those. They shouldn't be there. But anyway, so there's a very simple formula. Actually, the important bit is this over here. That's basically going to do a simple patch. It's going to just patch some information off to SharePoint. And in this function, we've got some properties and some functions where the moment that you run in context of this error handler, you've got a function called first error. And then it just goes and looks at the first error that's now currently in this context of this, and it generates a message. So we can just go and put a notification to the user and tell them what this message was so that they're also aware of it. And that prevents it from giving them that ugly red banner at the top, because this is now a handled error and it's no longer an unhandled error. And then at the top of this, you'll see there's this table that we generate that just grabs all the different error codes that have numbers by default, and we just give them names. So an example, error kind 1 means it's a syncing error to the database. Error kind 2 means there's something that was required that was missing. Error kind 3 is a create permission that's missing. So we just give those guys, those error kinds some names, and then we ship it off to SharePoint. So what this now looks like, if we now give it the same error, so let's go and say 1 divided by 0, you'll see that I get this notification pop up, and you would have also noticed the marching ants at the top of the screen, and that's how I was busy writing it back into the data source. If we go into the monitor, you'll see that there's still an error that then triggered that lookup into that table that we created, and it created a row into SharePoint. So if we now go into SharePoint You'll see there's another message over here with the session ID, the app name, and all of everything that we patched off from the application. All right, so that's pretty cool. But that's an error that was system generated, which you can also do if you wanted to combine this with some of your normal checks and balances in the system. You can use a function called error. And this allows you to generate an error. So I can go and say, check the following things, and if it's true or if it's not true, go and generate an error. And the function for that is called error. You then pass it an object with 3 properties in it. The first one is the message. And here we can just say, you got an error. Second property is the kind of error, and there we need to send it the error kind. Why don't you like that? I do. There you've got that list of error kinds that are basically enumeration, so I can go and select there was a edit permission or a file not found, and the source of this error was this control, so it might be button 33. And if you now trigger this, watch the screen at the top for the button that comes up, so it displays the error that you're passing to the error handler, and it ships it off to SharePoint. All right, so this is pretty cool. Second tech tip is the fact that in your error you can now throw emojis at your clients or at your users as well. So I didn't realize this, but actually that it renders properly in Powerapps and SharePoint and all of these sort of things. So if you want to give a smiley face to the users, in one of the previous sessions I showed how you could access your clipboard. How many of you guys you use your clipboard to make a backup of something, and then without thinking you copy something else and you're like, oh damn, that's gone. Actually the truth is it's not gone. So if you hit Windows key V instead of Control V, it allows you to access all of the previous things that you had in your clipboard to paste it, which is wonderful. But at the top you'll see that there's also other things that you can paste. There are emojis, there are GIFs, all of these important business tools that you really need. So you can go and say, I want to throw a smiley face or a laughing face to my users when they get this error. And the beautiful thing is, this even renders in the notification. So if I generate this pop-up, you'll see there it's got a smiley face in the error. And if I look at SharePoint, it actually worked earlier. There we go. There, we got the smiley face in SharePoint, so that's baked into it with it. All right, so that's basically me for my tech tip. Any questions? There's everything that you've got on your iPhone you can throw in there for an emoji. Yes, so it generates, look, even at runtime, even if in a healthy environment, it generates a lot of traffic. And the idea is, you'll see that in these, in this generic formula, my ear's falling off. So you'll see that we've got an exclusion list over here. So we can then go and say in time, if it's the following kind of errors, just don't log it, you know, and then, so you might actually start off with a very focused list of errors that you're looking for, and then open it up over time, or open it up to everything and then close it up over time. But in reality, that generates a lot of traffic. But don't be, you heard what Michael said, SharePoint's not scared. Like, why do you want to restrict it? Just, and while I laughed earlier, I think I told this in one of the previous meetups, this actually happened. We had a flow. I wanted to test delegation on Powerapps, because I was, a couple of years, this is like 3 years ago, I was reading about delegation issues on SharePoint, and I said, okay, I want to see this in action. So I created a flow. Well, actually, one of the guys who worked for us at the time created this flow. that would just go and create SharePoint list items. And that's all that that flow would do. It would do it in like batches of 50 kind of thing and just through the SharePoint list with items. And so we did the tests and we got to the bottom of delegation and we forgot about this flow. And this thing just kept on doing because that's what flow does. It just sort of flows. And a couple of months later, Michael phoned me, and I still don't know how that conversation happens from Microsoft, big global, to there's somebody in South Africa. Michael should know him. Michael phoned me and he said, listen, there's the SharePoint list in your environment with, I can't remember how many million items there were in it. Yeah, but can you please sort this out? So then we went and we couldn't access this thing. We couldn't do anything with it. I think we had to clean it up with PowerShell or something. It was just absolutely huge. So, but anyway, so in this case, you're fine. Just throw information at SharePoint. It can handle it. Good. Any questions? Thank you, everybody. That's me. Yeah. And so is that the end of the meetup? Any questions online?
No, it looks quiet, though. That was great.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. For the guys who came through, just watch out for the N1. There was an accident on the way here. So the traffic heading that way, heading north, is terrible on the N1. So just watch out for that and then enjoy the hamburgers. And for the guys who didn't bother to come in, you don't get in any hamburgers today. So, or traffic.
Or traffic, yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Sorry?